This is John King. I am speaking with Wyatt Glade. Now, Wyatt, you're a county attorney. Is that correct?
That is correct.
What county do you represent, sir?
Custer County.
Now, over in Custer County, I understand that you've had some issue getting information to use for prosecution in some drug cases. I was hoping you could kind of explain what's going on between your offices and the offices at DPHHS.
Yeah, this all started about a year ago, in December, in fact, and what I noticed is that the Department of Family Services, who regularly investigate incidences of child abuse and neglect, were encountering or coming across instances where children had been exposed to methamphetamine or other dangerous drugs and had evidence of that in the form of toxicology tests, primarily hair follicle tests. And they were not providing that evidence to law enforcement officers, who then would be able to investigate and potentially put together files for prosecution for an offense called endangering the welfare of children. Under that statute, it is a felony to expose children to methamphetamine or to methamphetamine paraphernalia. And so what I saw is that we had an interruption in the flow of information. It simply was not going from the Department of Family Services social workers to law enforcement officers. Now, typically, law enforcement officers have to report child abuse and neglect to Family Services, but in this instance, the Family Services workers were not reporting drug exposure to children back to law enforcement officers.
Are they required reporters as well then, or?
They are. At the time that we encountered this problem, the short answer to that is that social workers were required to report to law enforcement and or county attorneys when they were aware that children had been exposed to manufacture or distribution of dangerous drugs. However, they were not required to do so for exposure to drugs. Now, exposure to methamphetamine is extremely common in houses where methamphetamine is used for children because methamphetamine smoke is a particulate. It settles out of the air onto flat surfaces and, oftentimes on children's toys or things that end up exposing the child to the methamphetamine. There's some real serious health risks associated with it. So it was a major concern for me that portion was not included in the statute.
Now, I understand that there was a review of the processes by DPHHS, and that kind of led to requests to get the information more directly. Can you tell us what's happened in the last week or so?
Yeah. If I could just go back a little further.
Sure.
I approached Senator Eric Moore about this issue that the exposure part of this was not currently in the statute. He and I worked together and came up with a bill draft that was called Senate Bill 229. It passed by a large margin or a high margin in the legislature last session, and it did require social workers to report when they were aware that kids had been exposed to drugs. But the language of the amended statute says that they are to report the results of their investigation when they have reason to believe that a kid had been exposed to drugs. So to get to answering your question, this law became effective last July, and the department's interpretation of that law was such that they would simply make law enforcement officers aware when a kid was exposed to drugs, but they would not disclose the test results to the officers, which would then require the officers to either get a search warrant or, if you interpreted the law the way the department was interpreting it, we would have to have a hearing on the record with the parents present for us to be able to get that information. The department was operating under the assumption that a federal law that is often referred to as SAMHSA applied to this particular circumstance. And I argued with them for most of the last year. The gist of my argument is, number one, SAMHSA does not apply, or what we're calling SAMHSA. It's this prohibition on disclosing drug test results. That does not apply to these situations. And number two, even if it does apply, within that law there's an exception that allows for dissemination of this information to law enforcement agents when state law requires it to be done.
What was the argument? Why doesn't it apply in the first case?
So the federal law that the department was using to justify their position is a law that is used to protect people who are in federally funded substance abuse treatment centers. It is to protect their information from being disseminated to law enforcement. So let's assume that there's a person who has a drug addiction issue and they go to treatment and they relapse, and as part of their treatment there are records related to their relapse in those files. The law is aimed at prohibiting disclosure of that information. And so the department believed that applied to these children. My approach to this was that, number one, these children are not patients as defined under that federal law because they're not drug addicts seeking treatment in a federal program. And number two, this is not a federal program. This is the State Department of Public Health and Human Services. It's an investigation, not a drug treatment program. And go ahead.
Oh, I was going to ask. So you made these arguments about the way that they were maintaining their information, and then what happened?
So we have been going back and forth over those particular points for the last several months. We were scheduled to have a hearing in front of the Interim Committee on Child and Family Health Issues in November, and then the special session occurred. We weren't able to have the meeting then. It got moved to January 19th, which is when we did have that hearing. I provided them a written memo in advance of that hearing laying out my position. I can certainly get you a copy of that. It does spell out the arguments quite a bit more clearly than I've been able to. We showed up at the hearing, and myself and Leo Gallagher, Lewis and Clark County Attorney, presented our side of the story to the Interim Committee. Laura Smith, who's the Deputy Director, presented the Department's position to the Interim Committee. And the Interim Committee voted 7-1, I believe, to require the Department to comply with the law. I'm not exactly sure on the specific wording of what came out of that vote. I do know that the vote was 7-1.
Have they followed through? Have you seen information already this week?
Since that meeting, I have received an email from Sheila Hogan, the state director of the Department of Public Health and Human Services, where she has directed all of the regional supervisors to inform their social workers that the department has changed its policy and will now require the social workers to disclose the toxicology results directly to law enforcement and or county attorneys upon having reasonable cause to believe that the kids have been exposed to drugs.
What about pending and past cases?
I would assume it will cover pending cases. As far as past cases, I don't know the answer to that. I'll say that Sheila Hogan's memo did not differentiate between those two.
Okay. So as far as cases that are currently going, do you have some of those cases that have already received prosecutorial information concerning?
Yes, and I'll say that, like I mentioned, I started working on this a year ago. I tried to work on this with our local department. I was trying to set up a way for them to disseminate this information to law enforcement. So even though we went through this whole process of passing the law and back and forth with the department about how to implement the law, in that meantime, we have set up a method of exchanging that information. What we have had to do is had the law enforcement officers do a search warrant for that information. And so we've been receiving that information for about a year now, and we have been prosecuting cases based on that information and the additional investigations that come with it. But now I believe the process will be streamlined, particularly in larger jurisdictions where you're going to have a higher number of these cases. It will simply mean that the information gets to the law enforcement officers much more quickly with much less involvement from lawyers and judges and courts. And will result in quicker prosecution and better results.
Now, I think a lot of people would be kind of surprised to hear that the process was so convoluted before. Was it a surprise to you that it was so difficult to get information from one state agency to another?
Oh, man. Yes. I mean, I can't believe it took this much work to do so. And I can't speak for the department. I mean, I'm sure they have their reasons for this, but I couldn't find any that I agreed with. And to go back to my initial, the way that I discovered that this needed to happen is I was simply trying to get the department to provide this information to law enforcement officers, and the level of just sandbagging and stonewalling that I received on that particular front did shock me.
Do you feel that it put any lives in danger? I mean, obviously, if you have a case where a child has been tested to have been exposed to methamphetamine, every day that there's not a prosecution and that child's still in the home, I mean, it seems like there's a risk there.
True, but to be fair to the department, when they encounter this information, often the department gets involved through its procedures, through its own cases. You know, if a kid's in danger, they will remove the child, place the child in foster care. And so, you know, they're dealing with it in their own way. They are simply not involving law enforcement officers and the criminal justice system. I think that this will make it much better. I think this will provide much higher levels of accountability. It will open up avenues to better treatment for the parents for addiction issues. And I do ultimately believe that it will result in better protection for the children. The criminal justice system is the best option we have for dealing with these addiction issues.
All right. Well, hey, thanks so much for your time, Wyatt.
You bet.
And I hope things go well over in Custer County. Now,